Hello, 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 and welcome back to Tea.Coffee.Water. I am your host, Natalie Poindexter, and we have a little something different happening this week with coffee. Life changes, right? We all have learned to adapt, even if we don't like it. And so originally we were planning on doing a trio session with Michelle Vren and my friend Greg, but duty calls. And so Michelle is out fundraising and saving the world in the nonprofit space. And so you guys have a special treat. Greg and I are going to do a couple of sessions together. And I'm excited. So a little background, I've known Greg since, oh man, what, like 20? Well, I haven't aged a day over 25. So let's start there. We met at like 9 is basically the story I'm going to stick with. And it was at, what was it, Denison University.
Denison University
In Granville, Ohio. And if you are not familiar, since apparently Ohio is now popular, it's a thing. Like I'm hearing it. It's so strange because like before nobody even knew Ohio was a place to go. Right. And now it's like on Instagram and people are talking about like, oh, it's not like Ohio. And I'm like, do you even know if you had a map, could you find it? Like, could you point and be like, yep, there's Ohio right there.
Right.
And so, yeah, if you're ever in Columbus, Ohio, Granville is about 45 minutes, depending on how, ish. If you drive like you live in Texas, it's about 30, but you'll get there real quick. But it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. So please go visit. And we ended up just becoming friends from that and like have been friends ever since. And so when I was doing this piece around business and nonprofits and the state of nonprofits and like what is happening with all of these women who are leaving corporate America and wanting to start their nonprofit journey, I was like, yeah, we should talk. Like, we should definitely talk. And so in that time, space, and place, like, I know I've already shared your bio, but that's not really like, I can't tell everyone who you are in a paragraph. So what have you been up to? Where are you? What's happening? I know you're in Cleveland, all of those folks who, let me tell you how every time I meet somebody in Texas, the first or second place they mention, Cleveland.
Of course. Right.
Isn't that where LeBron's from? I'm like, he's actually not from there. But, and then I heard Akron was actually called Akron.
That may be somewhere.
That was one of my, I was like, oh, yeah. That's the fancy version.
That's the fancy version.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So please tell me everything, share with everyone why you're here. One, I twisted your arm to be here, but
yeah. So I'm here because I was invited by a friend, and so that's number one. I am friend responsive, and so I'm always going to do that because I as I stated before, one of the things I just try to do, I just try to be a good friend. That's all I'm trying to do in life. That's the main thing. But yeah, so I am in Cleveland, Ohio. One of the things I always kind of talk about, like what I do, is that like I lead faith-inspired organizations, right? And some of that are nonprofit organizations that I've done and led in the past in Columbus and also in Cleveland. But then also I'm a United Methodist pastor, ordained elder, and so I also lead churches, right? As well, and I often use this word to kind of faith-inspired because that is kind of often the missional thing, and maybe later on we'll talk about that sense of like mission and your why and like what fuels that the place, right? That is what inspires the work that we do each and every day. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm hanging out. I'm at a church called Corey United Methodist Church. It's a historic church known for a number of different things, but particularly for its work in Cleveland, Ohio, during the civil rights era. It became a place, right? When we talk about the sense of how important third spaces is, we talk about that in a sense as, that's like a new thing and the concept, like it's not, right? Like we know these places that were third spaces before that were integral, particularly for Black folk who were organized and doing advocacy work in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And that place for, and here in Cleveland in particular, was Core United Methodist Church, where we were a site that hosted, of course, a lot of big names that we talk about: W.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, right? All came through and did their work. But like for me, what I always point to is that the folks in the neighborhood organized and advocated for themselves to ensure that their neighborhoods, their children, that they had exactly what they needed. So that's some of the work I'm doing that as pastor there, executive director of our kind of associated nonprofit. Also just founded a cooperative parish, which is a whole nother thing. Yeah. So I just, multiple titles and only one paycheck. So
listen, we're gonna try to fix that. Yes. But okay, so I have so many things, and I'm trying to be a good host, right? And not be my typical but wait, I have something that I just want to jump in because this was so juicy, right? But something that Michelle and I were talking about is creating relationships and building relationships. And so the fact that you were like, I just want to be a good friend, right? Like it's so much more than that. Like I have this thing that I've been saying this year of hashtag connecting responsibly, because there might be someone in my world or in your world where you're like, yep, I need to connect them to Natalie, or I need to connect them to Greg. But I know that they're not in the right place or space to get the most out of that relationship. And I think that's just so powerful, especially making friends as an adult. Like that's truly networking, right? Like this, I go to these networking events and I'm like, okay, Natalie, you have 3 people you have to talk to at minimum, right? But I think that's just to go on again, right? Of saying sometimes you do meet people as adults and you're like, yep, that person. Like, I don't know how, way, what, when, but they've got to be in my orbit more often than not. And I think, the other piece that really was just hitting home from conversations that I've had with potential clients, the conversations that Michelle and I were having around most nonprofits, you see them and they're like 5 years in and it's like 4 people. And they've been raising money, running programs, saving the community, building relationships, creating third tier programs. Like they're doing it all with a few people. And I don't think Michelle and I got into it previously, but the conversation around burnout was massive during COVID, but it was burnout for healthcare providers,
right?
Those working the response. And I'm just curious, my first question is how are you all talking about burnout, or are you talking about burnout in the nonprofit space? And if not, when do we start that conversation? Because, or is it that your passion is supposed to drive, lead, propel, fund, fuel, create a space for you to just never leave and always keep coming back with that 6 hats and 1 paycheck?
No, that's an interesting question, and honestly, it's something I've been thinking about a lot, right? So I've been thinking about burnout a lot, and I've been. So I wish I can remember how I was engaged in this conversation or where this kind of started. But one of the things that I was talking about, I'm talking to some folks, we're talking about the sense of where we are, mental health, and how do we kind of continue to lead this work. And we talk about the sense that burnout is not necessarily about time, right? It is really about, if at best it's energy, right? And it is passion, it's some of those other pieces, right? That there are people who I know can work 80 hours a week doing a job and they just knock it out, right? Because they may love what they do. What it is fulfilling to their heart. It is a part of their soul work. It's part of all the pieces of it. I know some people who can do something that's a task that's 1 hour a week, and that they burnt out from that. Right, it is that element, right? And that's what some of the conversations we got into. So one of the things that I dealt with, right, again, because small organization, trying to but having significant impact. One of the things that we dealt with was we were coming to a crossroads in terms of what are we going to do with some of this work that we're called to do. So we're doing a lot of kind of food justice type on the ground, like, meals out the door, pantry stuff out the door, things that nature work. And it is work that was in some ways important. It also was duplicated work. There were other places that were doing some similar work for us. But it was work that was exhausting for us. And it came, and finally, the reason when I made that decision, it was a hard decision to make, that we were going to stop doing that. And we closed our pantry, we closed our hot meals. And the real reason was because I realized that I wasn't burned out from necessarily doing the work, but in some ways the fact of the background, right? That we were serving when we really should have been solving. Right. And the place I'm at, the church I was at, they have been serving meals and food pantry stuff and doing that type of work since like the 1970s, right? And at some point it just hit me. It's like, oh, so we're feeding the grandchildren, right, of the people we started feeding in the 70s.
Yes.
And I was like, and that's when that reality hit me, that's when I got burned out. Because I was like, we're doing the wrong thing. All our energy is going towards a sense of serving when we actually have the ability to start solving some of these root causes why we're there, right? Because apparently what we've been doing for the last 50 years is not working.
Right.
Right. That's not fixing. It's not fixing the actual things that are happening right now. There. So, but we always in these conversations about like burnout and really trying to get to the sense of like, so what is it that's caused? What's this root cause, right? Is it the actual, is it the actual time? Most time it's not that. Like it's more so that like what this is no longer serving our mission, is no longer serving my own passion, is no longer serving the sense of why, right, that we said we're doing this work anyway.
Oh man, so I'll make sure I keep this in mind for our next episode we do together around strategy and sustainability. But I think more on the holistic side, right? Like as a public health professional, that makes I know we've had these conversations over and over and over again, right? We've gone from urban heat island effect to community gardens capabilities to building, right? And I think it's so interesting. And I'm going to relate this back to how I've shifted in my own business. And I initially started off as a grant writer and technical writer because funding was everywhere, right? People were like, and it was public health funding. And, COVID happened, but people still really don't quite know what public health means. Like if I explained my day-to-day life during COVID in all of the different roles that I was in, most of the time people were like, you did that? And I'm like, yeah, funny thing, plus others, right? Plus other things were happening. And so, thinking about that from that perspective of like, yes, I'm going to help all of these folks get some public health funding. But what I realized is when they wanted to go get this public health funding, they didn't have a program to go along with it. They just wanted to get the money to give it to the community. And it's like, okay, but yes, right? Like we are talking initial resources. And when we were doing like loading cards to get people, they don't have jobs, things like that. Sure. But beyond that, right, it's a little bit more holistic. It's a little bit more in the trenches, right? We're really rolling our sleeves up and saying, what does this community need? And what are we as this organization that's getting funding going to do to address that need?
Yeah.
Right. Because it doesn't take away from your overall mission, right? You're still community mission oriented, but you're like, what is this specific program going to do and serve? And so I had to shift. I had to shift my business because like people are like, yes, we want to go get this funding. And I'm like, okay, what's your methodology to go and do this project? And they're like, well, we're just going to do what we've always done.
Right.
Okay. Well, that's not going to work, right? That's not even what they asked for, actually, right? And so when you have to, like, I just think that's so powerful of what you're saying of like, burnout is beyond time, energy, effort, passion, capability, right? It's really, are we actually doing anything? Because yes, that is fantastic. Like you're feeding people that are hungry. But I use this analogy when I talk to my executives And I'm like, that metaphor of, if you give a man a fish, he eats for one day.
Mm-hmm.
But if you teach him how to fish, he eats for a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, if I can teach my executives how to fish and they understand the ins, outs, ups, downs.
Yeah.
I don't fish, so don't quote me on the rods, the bait. It's disgusting. It stinks. Greg, come on, like it
Hey,
smells.
look, I get it.
It's bad. I know. I'm probably just don't. I cried the first and last time I ever went fishing because I had to kill a worm. Sobbed. Now, as you've known in my life, right? I've gone from that person to an EMT, and now I don't know how that happened, but I digress. But like, I just think about, right, when we're solving that problem, but we're also teaching, it changes the conversation, because it's great if they know that they can always come and get food from you, right? But like, what are we doing for the conversations around growing food, around accessing programs, right? I'm sure, and Michelle and I talked about this previously, that like there are groups, networks that come to the table, and they come to the table, and she's talking about this from a conservation perspective. And she's like, we come to the table and everybody's saying what they're doing. And then you find out that somebody across the table is doing the exact same thing you're doing, but there wasn't any communication.
Yeah.
And so you find out you're either doing duplicative work, or you're doing work that could have like helped, supported, made your life a little easier, right? Or thinking, like, relating this all back to funding, could have been a funding funding arm.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested, like, being an executive director, like you are in it, right? You are in it every day. You are making the decisions. You are having these conversations. You are building these relationships. You are teaching, learning, educating, delegating, all of these things, right? Like, when is there a time to intentionally create relationships that have a sustainable plan? And what I mean by that is, like, you had the space at the food pantry, right? Who had the space for the agriculture growth? Or who had the space that's doing policy work that's changing the access in the community that you're in to improve what they can get, right? Like, when do you, is that a conversation that you get to have? Is that, or let me rephrase, is that a hat that you have time to wear?
Yeah. And that's one of the that's right when that's one of the difficulties, right? When you come to it, the first time you said, like, when you have time to do it, I was like, there's no time to connect, right? There's a reason, right? And that's being real, right? There's a reason, like, there's duplicated services, because everybody is kind of in their own place, and like we kind of. And at times I think we can unfairly castigate, right, folks who are kind of doing this work and have duplicated service, because they're like, well, why didn't they just talk to them? It's like, because, like, it takes some damn time.
Yeah.
Like, I gotta not only, like, deal with the things that I'm dealing on a regular basis. I gotta try to think ahead in terms of, like, what's happening. I gotta kind of be and build relationship with potential funders about what's going on. But I gotta also be able to be responsive, right, to my neighborhood, right, to have conversations to ensure that I am not telling my community this is what you need, but I'm also having a time to actually spend time and say, like, what are you dreaming about, right? What are you desiring? What do you hope for your family and for your kids, or for your cousins, or for the kids on this block, right? That may not even belong to you, but you still care for them because you want them to kind of grow up in a place as well. And kind of starting those places. Like, I think that's some of the hard part of this work, because you got a lot of small organizations that are working to try to be deeply rooted with the people that they're connected to, and yet also have to constantly be kind of above and talking to folks who are not a part of the community, and are constantly going back and forth. So so it's difficult. So I named that reality, but I think some of the ways in which, for me in particular, that I've been able to do that, is just being intentional, and I'm liking a lot of this kind of cohort based program that was happening. So I know a couple foundations have done this, where some of what they actually are awarding is not necessarily a grant, but it's entree to
Service.
this kind of cohort based type of thing. We say like,
Mhm.
hey, we're gonna bring together these, these 20, 30 nonprofit leaders so they can journey along with each other. And then in the process, not only are we going to kind of offer them some resources to kind of learn some new things, to adapt to a changing landscape, but they also have this chance to connect and see where the place in which they connect. And then they all of a sudden their relationship base has been greatly expanded, because not only do they have the resources and the networks of the people that are now in this room that are coming together, these 20 people coming together once a month, but they also then have the resources and networks of, right? That's something that for me that I've been able to kind of benefit from, right? I'm part of this group that's it's funded by a foundation here in Cleveland. And it's a group of kind of 20 other faith-inspired organizations that kind of doing this similar community-based work. Some of them are on kind of the more beginning end of it. Some of them have been doing this stuff for decades, right? And yet we're all operating and working together, and we're able to journey alongside each other in that. And so I think being able to potentially find spaces like that, I think people who have the ear of either larger nonprofits or of philanthropic organizations, and
Mm.
start saying to them that, hey, maybe what you can be, the best thing you can be in this place is not just to offer a grant, but to be a convener, right? Where you offer
Mhm.
space for people to be able to come together and be able to work together. And I think also, and now there also in some ways is a larger narrative that's there as well, right?
Interesting.
Because a
Okay.
part of this is the fact that we also have to change the way in which we think about nonprofit work and about
Mhm.
making those connections, right? Where we don't see each other in some ways as my competitor, right? Because that's some of the
Yep.
word, like I'm competing against this person for gift,
Yes.
and it happens, right?
Yes.
I remember in my own organization, we were kind of going out for some grants, and someone who was working with me in his work was like, oh, we always seem to be competing with this one place. And I was like, we're not competing, right? We in this together. And
Yes.
if we don't get the grant and they did, we still gonna applaud. We're still gonna celebrate, right?
Mhm.
Because I know the work and the commitment and the things they're doing. It's also gonna be great for the community parts. Like I think so in some ways, some shifting some of that narrative that we're not competitors, but we're coming together this, to uplift our communities in the ways in which we can, in which we need to. So
No, yeah, Michelle and I were talking about changing mindsets. And
mm-hmm,
we had this
mm-hmm,
conversation. She had this comment about the abundance versus scarcity mindset.
yeah,
And I think that, when you're in a space where you are literally elbow deep into the
mm-hmm,
community, right? Creating these relationships, building these projects, these programs, etc. And you're like, you can say, okay, we didn't get that grant, but we know who did.
yeah,
And we know what they're going to be doing. And so I can still serve my community by saying, hey, I understand that we're your typical, but we also have this relationship,
yeah,
maybe not, or we just know, right? We just know that this group is down the street doing something you need. And so I'm curious, right? Like when we talk about changing our mindsets, which is change management, which is something that is not yes, behavior change, but also like it is true organizational change management.
mm-hmm,
Because
mm-hmm,
if it doesn't come from the ED, then how it's like if you don't understand it from the top down, from the bottom up, it's not gonna work. Like
mm-hmm,
there aren't enough, you don't have enough clout. That's all it is. That's the end of the
yeah,
statement, right? If you
yeah,
are the boots on the ground and your ED is not like, yes, change management role, right? You're stuck. You're stuck like Chuck.
mm-hmm,
It's not going to go anywhere. And
yeah,
so having that conversation around like behavior change, change management, organizational change, transformation, when when can you, or I guess I should say, when did you uh readily accept, and I know you used that example previously, right, of like it was a hard decision to make, but I made the decision to stop serving food because we weren't fixing anything, we weren't solving, let me rephrase, we weren't creating a solution that is
mm-hmm,
sustainable
right,
for our community to be
right,
successful
right. Yeah, fix the
generations
system.
on,
Thank you. I
right?
appreciate that.
Yes. So, and I say that very intentionally, right? Because there's all of these conversations around like women who are leaving corporate America. And I'm leading this back to this question of like, they're like, yes, we want to start a nonprofit. And I always ask them why. What is the point, right? And they usually tell me one of two things: donations and grants. And I'm like, yes, that's fantastic. Yeah, those are good reasons. One, funding. But two, like, that's not it. You have to know what is in the trenches of your community, because in public health, we call these like drive-by initiatives where you come in and you quote unquote fix something and then you bang out, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't the need of the community. So, right, like not having a Natalie in your ear, like, you should talk about these things with a holistic systemic approach, Greg, like go after these things, right? When do you have that internal change within the organization? How do you have that conversation with other executive directors? And like, what if you have had that conversation, what does that sound like? Like, are people like, you know what, Greg, you might be onto something, or they're like, shoe fly, like, don't bother me. We've been doing this. We know what we're doing. You're young. You haven't been in it long enough. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious. Like, has that even happened? I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and in some ways, let me say this way. So I have multiple constituencies, right? That I have to kind of have conversations with and come back to and kind of hear and make sure that I'm being heard, but also make sure that I'm hearing and that I am satisfying, right? The desires, the delights, the beliefs of many different people, right? And so I think in that, what I've realized is that there's been some constituencies that's been more readily available, right, to do that. And really what it means is that like in certain instances, I have to frame, right, this work in different ways, right? So to folks who are, again, I'm part of a denomination that has a particular structure, so I have to report back to people. Folks who are ecclesial administrators who don't often have the same ability of imagination about what's possible, right? Because they're not on the ground, they're not there. They kind of have a way of, we do things this way and that's it, right? And so for me, a lot of that conversation has been being able to kind of shape the narrative based on two things. One, outcomes, right? So that I've been able to point to things and say, hey, look what we just did there, right? And begin that conversation and to kind of help them shape some of the narrative. And I think there's been also those who are kind of in the ground. And I think one of the things I think we've really done well, and I think what has caused us to move in the direction we've done is that we have been very intentional about knowing who we are, right, as an organization, as a entity, kind of understanding our history, right, and kind of those elements, and then allowing that to kind of move us forward, right? So we start from this place of identity, and because we began at this place of identity, we move. We're able to live into that, right? And that's where we have found success, is by being able to more and more clearly articulate exactly who we are and what we're trying to do.
So I know we're getting close to our time, but I'm curious, do you have any, what do you think of all of these new entrepreneurs stating that nonprofit is the way to go?
I can't say that I understand their reason behind it, but I will say, as a person who is doing the work I'm doing, so the way in which we talk about the work we're doing is preservation-based economic development, right? So a lot of work we're doing is with the historic preservation of our building, and with even some of the neighborhood as historic sites that we're hoping to kind of start and develop as well, that are residential homes and that nature. Like, all that work is great. but the goal of that is ultimately like create opportunities for economic development, right? That because we do the work of kind of restoring and reusing, doing some adaptive reuse of spaces, we can actually push this work out. One of the things that I keep coming back to is that what we need most are entrepreneurs who are there and committed to create uh, uh, it, wealth and income and economic possibilities in our neighborhood. We need job creating entities in our neighborhoods. We need small companies and entrepreneurs who are able to come in and to create opportunity that may then grow into something that's larger and begin to employ many people. Like I sure, if that's what you want to do, if you want to create a arm that is kind of philanthropic in its endeavors, that's awesome. But start your business that allows you to make as much money as you can, so that you then can reinvest some of that not only into your own organization, but then also into the organizations that are already at work, right? Like I look at our neighborhood. Our neighborhood doesn't need another nonprofit. Our neighborhood needs about 10 to 12 entrepreneurs who want to come in and can be able to say, hey, we can create viable solutions here in this place, right? We can be a part of creating a business center, right, along this kind of historic business corridor, so we can be able to re-energize this community, right? Like that's me. When I look at the situation, like I think that same energy you want to put into this nonprofit, I think you need to put into this for-profit, right? And embark on building businesses that are able to provide just opportunities.
Oh man, I think that's fantastic, because I feel like one that flows directly into the next conversation that we're going to be having, our following episode. And I think that like some of these women I'm having these conversations with, right? Like I'm in these entrepreneurship networking groups. I'm talking to women who are like, yeah, I think nonprofit, right? And so being able to have someone who is in the trenches, who gets it, who lives it, who works it every day and has worked it at an executive level, to be able to say like, hey, when was the last time you had a conversation with the nonprofits in your community or your area of focus? Because if you haven't had any conversations with them and your goal is to go and become an entrepreneur, they're not your competitors, right? But they might actually be doing the work that you're already doing. So where is the gap? Like, where is that gap that you can fill as an entrepreneur coming into this space? And like create that synergy that's necessary, versus saying like, I'm gonna, as we, many folks at nonprofits say, like, I'm going to stand on this hill and die on it.
And if I could, I know we got to come to an end, but if I could just insert, right? So there's also another side of the story as well, right?
Okay.
So why is it that there are a lot of women who have decided to say, we're going to do this nonprofit instead of do this other business, right? It is often because we can see women leading some nonprofits. We don't see women as people who are creating businesses. And I think that then narrative has then been imposed. And so I think some of this, right, is a work that, as a man, right, and also as a Black man, especially being able to encourage and say like, you have the ability to not only start a business, but then to create a business that begins to employ people, that begins to create significant change, right? As well. And I think that's like, we got to be honest about that underlying piece, right? There's a reason folks go to nonprofit, because they believe they can be trusted there. There's a lot of leadership of women in nonprofit that they can see and they can at least go to, but that may not always exist on the same way with for-profit entrepreneurship.
No, and I was at this, shout out to Fiesta community. If you're here in Austin, highly recommend going to some of these. They have a women's founders group that meets the first Monday of every month. So again, if you're a female founder in Austin, definitely look it up. Fiesta community. And we get to sit in these little breakout sessions, these little intimate groups with each other, and have conversations. And we have these probing questions. and I was leading the group somehow on Monday, co-leading the group. And one of the questions we were talking about is, navigating imposter syndrome. And one of the women was saying, well, I would like to become an entrepreneur, but I'm not really sure if I can. But my background is running other people's companies for them.
Mm. Mm.
And I was like, time out, flag on the play, tech on your words, don't speak anymore. You say absolutely nothing. I'm standing on my soapbox. I don't care what we have to talk about, but you have to hear what I have to say. And I was like, I'm just confused because if you are in fact running someone's startup for them, meaning you have kept it operationally going, you have kept it financially going, you have kept it organizationally going, you have from an inside second level executive role. What? Why aren't you the CEO? What's wrong with being the CEO? Why is that a problem, right? And we had this breakdown of conversation about imposter syndrome. And it was truly like this moment where I got to like remind everyone, like we as women, not we as minority women, but like we as women made that up in the 70s. But imposter syndrome is not an actual health related syndrome. It is something that we have conditioned ourselves to believe that we are experiencing.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how are we imposters in a system that didn't want us there in the first place?
Right.
And continues to still not want us there, right? Like if you look at the CEOs for for-profit entities across the United States, they are 6 foot plus white men.
Yeah.
There's data behind it. This is not just me. You know what I mean? Like, I promise I'm not like, this is not, Tea.Coffee.Water, Natalie edition made up data. Like, this is legit, right? Like, there's data behind it. And so it's exactly what you said, right? I'm curious what the data says for the amount of women who are president CEOs in the nonprofit space. Right? Like, what does that look like? Is there a massive, difference between men versus women in that nonprofit world? I don't know. Right? But like, I think you hit on an extremely powerful point that leaving your corporate job, one, I think the other mentality is like, I don't want to start a for-profit because it's a corporate experience and I'm leaving the corporate experience because it's bogus bullshit.
Yeah.
Like fact, end of statement, right? Like I'm tired. I don't like it. I don't want to do, non-promotable tasks any longer, right? Like, or be asked to call on, right? Like I don't want to do that. So maybe that mentality too of if I start a corporate company, not a for-profit company, I'm perpetuating that same internal structure versus nonprofits care about people. Nonprofits like passion. I'm like, that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But I just think, I feel like, man, understanding that aspect of what you just said of like why women are thinking about this. I think that is something to chew on. That is something I will absolutely have more conversations about. I am curious about the data. And
me too now.
Yeah, right. Oh, little did we know. We thought it was going to be like 2 episodes, and now it's like, who knows what's going to happen.
Right.
But I know we have done this intro, and I know we have so much more to talk about. And I know we can talk for, just like sit in a room. I feel like, sometimes when we have our conversations, they take me back to like this like 60s where you're in this like dimly lit room, you know what I'm saying? And everybody's around a table and there's like some cigar smoke coming up and and it's just this whole like slam on the table, like, but I have one more thing, right? And so thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I was like super pumped about this. I was like telling everybody, like, don't worry, it's gonna get better. It's not just me talking this entire time, I promise. And so yeah, our next episode about sustainability and strategy in the nonprofit realm. Stay tuned, listeners. Come back. I mean, like, if you had fun, which I had blast this time, like this next one is I think it's going to get some conversations going while sitting in the car by yourself or while you're doing, making dinner, listening to this. Like there is definitely going to be some ad libs coming to this next episode. So
Absolutely.
please join in. Throw any questions or comments in the chat with the show notes. It's posted on Spotify. I'll definitely drop Greg's information in there. So if you're in the Cleveland area and you're like, yes, everything he just said, I need to connect with this guy. Like I need to talk to him. Or I mean, I think even having a time for you to come and tell about the historical experience of working at Corey Methodist Church. Like I mentioned that you were in Cleveland to some friends and they were in I was in another country, actually. I mentioned this, like they were like, oh yeah, we're originally from Cleveland. This is how crazy it is, y'all. The Corey Methodist Church, right? That name, I didn't remember the name, right? And I promise I'm coming to a conclusion, but I was like, yeah, I have a friend in Cleveland. He works at a really big church there. And they were like, oh, Corey? Maybe, yes, I think so. I don't know. I forget the name of it. And they were like, oh, if it's a big Methodist Black church in Cleveland, it's Corey. And I was like, oh, he's famous. Like,
Oh my God.
immediately, I was like, yep, I know him. And I
Yeah.
added it to your resume for the 14th time. I was like,
Thank
oh,
you.
yeah, he
Yeah.
runs like 6 organizations
Yeah.
there. And yes, he's building he's building compounds and communities.
That's
Like,
right.
this,
Condos, like, yeah, we're doing it all.
you don't even know. Like, yeah, that's my friend. So I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you for
Yes.
coming and joining me.
Glad to be
And
here. Glad to be here.
y'all come back and listen next week. We're gonna have even more fun. And then hopefully we can find some time to bring Michelle and Greg back together and just knock y'all socks off all over again. So thank you for joining me, and we will see you next week.